first, thanks to Professor Murray for coming from York University in Toronto, Canada, to speak to us today. It's funded by the Casal Fund, so I need to thank the Casal Fund for providing the money necessary. Professor Murray is Professor of Anthropology. He's published significant work studying homophobias in the Caribbean and on Caribbean gender identity refugees, which he'll talk a bit about. He's the author of Opacity, which is an ethnography concerning gender, sexuality and race in Martinique, and of Flaming Souls, a book studying homosexuality and the lives of queer men in Barbados. He's got an edited volume, Homophobias, which brought together papers detailing the emergence of homophobia in different contexts, and received the 2010 Ruth Benedict Award for Best Anthology from the American Anthropological Association. His more recent work has looked at migrants within the Caribbean, the Canadian refugee mechanism, which I think we're going to speak a bit more about today.
Not so much, actually.
No? the wine, with wine afterwards.
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
Before we start, I suppose I should say that we're recording the event today, but because the camera's just going to be focused on us. Yeah. But it's just to be aware for the questions. That will be recorded. So without further ado,
thank you very much. Can you hear me at the back? Okay. Okay, thanks. And I'm just going to sit if that's okay with everyone. So first of all, just thank you very much to William and the Institute of Latin American Studies for this invitation. It's really an honor to be able to speak to you today. I'm mainly going to be talking about issues pertaining to homophobia and human rights in the English and French-speaking Caribbean. And I'm really looking forward to your comments and questions. I'm hoping this paper will not be too long, so we have time for a conversation. And before I start, I think it's also relevant to note that I'm an anthropologist, so my approach to these questions is informed by ethnographic methods and experiences. It's applied to some current critical scholarship from queer theory and feminist studies in transnational contexts. And furthermore, I've conducted ethnographic research primarily in Martinique and Barbados, as William was mentioning. So they're going to be my primary examples in the following discussion. And by no means am I trying to imply that these two societies stand for the English and French-speaking Caribbean. And in fact, I'm hoping to argue something of the opposite. One of the problems in global North discussions of the Caribbean is that of regionally homogeneous representations. And in fact, the reality of the contemporary Caribbean societies is something that's much more complex. So, this is old school. There's no PowerPoint, just paper and a couple of websites that I'll show you. Hopefully you can see a bit of them. They're just sort of some illustrations. So in recent years, across much of the global north, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer, or LGBTQ, community events and human rights organizations have shifted their focus from local to global rights for sexual minorities, pressuring most, but by no means all, global South governments to change laws criminalizing homosexuality or create laws to support the human rights of sexual minorities. In these events and discussions about global homophobia and the importance of the rights of sexual minorities, the Caribbean often appears as an example of one of the problem regions requiring immediate attention and action. So for example, in 2009, Human Rights Watch published the report Together Apart, Organization Around Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity, which argued that, quote, many groups defending LGBT rights, especially throughout the global South, still have limited access to funding and courageously face sometimes murderous attacks without adequate support from a broader human rights community, unquote. The report provided brief overviews of sexual rights abuses and activisms in every region of the world. The Caribbean region was one of the most problematic areas according to this report. Then in 2014, the New York Times carried an op-ed piece titled Homophobia in the Caribbean, focusing on a pattern of homophobic violence, that's a quote from an article, in which Jamaica and some other parts of the Caribbean were identified as being particularly homophobic. Sometimes we see more nuanced reports, such as a 2014 Huffington Post article, which argues for recognizing the Caribbean as a region with diverse positions on sexual minorities. However, this report also evaluated homophobia on national scales and ranked countries from least to most homophobic. I have this is a poster that went along with the Huffington Post article, which you can't see too well there. But in its ranking of homophobic from least to most, the Dutch Caribbeans were put at the top as least homophobic, and Jamaica was at the other end as most homophobic. And the French Antilles were sort of in the less homophobic section of that ranking. But in this and other reports, the antidote to violence against sexual and gendered minorities is usually presented as a dual-pronged strategy of decriminalizing homosexual acts and protecting the rights of LGBT individuals. And we often also see language that assesses Caribbean society's progress towards equal rights for LGBT people. So one of my concerns with homophobia as a way to speak about sexual discrimination in large geographic regions like the Caribbean is that it is now often presented as a sociocultural trait, or more accurately, a pathological sociocultural trait in which a very large group of Caribbean people's sexual attitudes are being judged negatively, usually from a Euro-American perspective, in which the latter's sociosexual attitudes are generally compared favorably to that of the former. Homophobia, in other words, is no longer something attributed to individuals or institutions in one's home community or society. Homophobia has gone global, and to be accused of being homophobic is to be accused of something more than just not liking homosexuals. It is also to be less advanced or less civilized than nations where LGBT rights are ostensibly enshrined. Furthermore, this accusation now carries potentially serious economic and political repercussions for nations that are guilty of such discriminatory practices. For example, in 2011, then Prime Minister David Cameron threatened to cut foreign aid funding to countries that discriminated against homosexuals. More recently, in regional political organizations like the Commonwealth and La Francophonie, discussions of penalties for countries not endorsing sexual minority rights are currently a hot topic of debate. But what are the effects of utilizing homophobia as a sociocultural trait or pathology, which is increasingly attached to moral, political, and economic agendas of governments, development agencies, and human rights organizations? Is it problematic to speak of communities, regions, or nations as homophobic? Who is privileged and who is silenced in such a claim? Is homophobia a universal prejudice that operates along identical axes of difference in power, or does it operate differently across diverse social, political, and economic terrains? If so, then how is it located in and generated through these terrains? In relation to the Caribbean, if forms of sexual inequality exist in Caribbean societies, where do they come from? What or who produces them? Who challenges them, and how do they propose to eliminate them? Are human rights the best framework to challenge them? So in this paper, I'm going to focus on and unpack two sort of central terms to these discussions on sexual diversity and discrimination in the French and English-speaking Caribbean. Homophobia is the first term, and human rights is the second term. So these are both terms that circulate on a global scale, but I would like us to think carefully about how they are situated in and move through the Caribbean region, particularly the English and French-speaking islands. A comparative approach helps attune us to the complexity of so-called universal terms and the actions attached to them. In a post or neo-colonial region, with broad historical similarities, yet quite diverse contemporary social, cultural, and political realities. As Anna Singh has noted in her study of development and environmental activism in Indonesia, we should not take universals at their face value. Existing universalisms are hybrid, transient, and involved in constant reformulation through dialogue. What she calls engaged universals travel across difference and are charged and changed by their travels, landings, and connections in different locations. Singh speaks about how cultures are continually co-produced in the interactions she calls friction, the awkward, unequal, unstable, and creative qualities of interconnection across difference. I find that friction works well in thinking through how universal terms like homophobia and human rights have global connections, yet move through different Caribbean societies with different effects, allowing us to carefully consider local encounters with globally circulating concepts and actions associated with these concepts. So as I say in this paper, I focus on Martinique and Barbados in order to demonstrate how discussions about the existence of homophobia in the Caribbean and human rights as the weapon to combat it only get us so far if we don't engage with the frictional qualities found through close attention to local histories, politics, and activisms. So let me begin with the term homophobia. A few years ago, when I initiated a call for papers for an edited volume examining homophobia in different locations around the globe from an ethnographic perspective, there was a lively discussion amongst the authors as to whether or not homophobia should be the framing term, given the very different ways in which sexual discrimination and prejudice operate in diverse societies. However, the authors in this volume finally agreed on two simple but fundamentally important points. First, the term homophobia, which means fear of the same when you translate it directly from its Latin and Greek origins, is for the most part located in a psychological, individualized framework emphasizing irrational fear, which is a problematic definition on a number of levels. In many cases, discrimination or violence against homosexuals is not due to an irrational fear, nor can it be understood as a fear or hatred that resides only in individual psyches. Rather, homophobia is a socially produced form of discrimination located within relations of inequality. Furthermore, it is a form of discrimination that is not always or only couched in terms of hatred or fear. Discrimination of homosexuality can be conveyed through a range of attitudes, from indifference to dismissal, scientific logic, tolerance, or even a carefully delimited embrace, as in love the sinner, not the sin. Second, the volume's authors agreed that the relations of inequality in which homophobia is produced are arranged differently in local contexts. That is, anti-homosexual prejudice is produced through intersections of discourses of inequality, which are in turn generated through intersections of local and global forces. Thus, although it might appear that homophobia is always about homosexuality, this is only partly true. Or to put it more accurately, homophobia is rarely ever just about homosexuality. In other words, what appears to be the same thing around the world, the persecution of sexual and gender minorities, is a phenomenon that's produced through a complex nexus of gender, class, and race inequalities, which are tied to long-term local and transnational political and economic relations of inequality. So let me give you an example from my work in Barbados. Over a course of a series of research trips to Barbados between 2002 and 2008, I was struck by the saturation of local media coverage on homosexuality. Homosexuality was being discussed in a variety of Barbadian, or as locals say, Bajan, media sites that ranged from newspapers to the internet and the radio. Much of the news in Bajan media was focusing at the time on same-sex rights and justice struggles occurring elsewhere around the globe, such as the same-sex marriage debates in Europe. However, in 2004-05, there were a number of public forums held in Barbados to elicit feedback on a report that had been commissioned by the Attorney General's office, which focused on strategies to combat the spread of HIV/AIDS in Barbados. One strategy in this report was a recommendation for the decriminalization of homosexuality in order to reduce stigma and fear associated with the virus. Now, in Barbados currently, there are laws in the criminal code which are interpreted to be anti-homosexuals. These laws specifically criminalize acts of buggery and serious indecency. So strictly speaking, one could say that this means heterosexual buggery is outlawed as much as homosexual buggery, but in almost all the contemporary discussions, these laws are utilized as primary example of the state's criminalization of homosexuality. So these public forums and the suggestion to change the criminal code generated a lot of coverage in the op-ed and led us to the editor sections of local newspapers like The Nation and The Advocate, as well as generating conversations on local radio stations and the internet. So for example, on a radio talk show called Down to Brass Tacks, which is a daily sort of call-in show, the topic of the day was, has Barbados become an immoral society? Which the host elaborated on by saying, quote, are we too tolerant of homosexuality, prostitution, and other so-called perverted trends now evident in Barbados, unquote. Now, there was a lot of calls that day, and the vast majority of the callers agreed that Barbados was indeed becoming immoral, and that immorality could be defined primarily in terms of permissive attitudes towards homosexuality and prostitution. During the program, some callers provided explanations of why this type of immorality was taking over Barbados, and I think they're worth focusing on. So one caller said, quote, at the core, we've become selfish. It's a direction we've been going in progressively. There's the consumerism that is driving most of the issues related to the economy. It's leading us down the path to perversion, unquote. Another caller made a similar comment, quote, men and women are involved in all this kinky sex because it's a reflection of where we are in the society. It's this consumerism. People have big houses, enough money, they're bored and don't know what to do with themselves, so that is what they do, unquote. One other example with a different explanation comes from a website focusing on Barbadian news and culture. On this site, an individual named Lost Boy, who self-identified as an American tourist, posted a comment saying he was planning to visit Barbados and he wanted to know if gay tourists were welcome there. So one reply was posted by someone named Assassin, who self-identified as a Bajan male. It's a fairly lengthy quote, but it's an interesting one. So he said, gay people are not welcomed by the majority of Bajans. People like you might think our laws against homosexuals are wrong, but you will abide by the laws of this country. You seem to be of the opinion that the poor, pitiful, uneducated people of Barbados should be down on our hands and knees, kissing the ground tourists like yourselves walk on just because you are willing to come and spend money in our country. Keep that pro-homosexual propaganda drivel in your own country. We don't condone it here. Why should anyone listen to what America has to say about other countries' laws? Have you ever really sat down and analyzed the moral morass that your country currently exists in? Very prescient for the current moment. So that's the end of his quote. So as you can see, much of this sort of feedback media, but by no means all of it, evaluated homosexuality negatively. But what I'm wanting to draw attention to here is the way in which homophobia is being framed in these comments. Some callers and letter writers speak about a changing economy, which negatively impacts the moral fiber of Barbados, encouraging selfish, indulgent behaviors through rampant consumerism. In these comments, I'm positing that the anti-homosexual position is in indicative of a moral panic for some Barbadians that's produced in relation to rapid social and economic transformations, which reinforce for some, but not all, a long-standing perception of Barbados' marginality and powerlessness on the global stage. For some Bajans, a sense of increasing marginalization within a nation that for many years was touted locally and internationally as a Caribbean success story in terms of its overall wealth and political stability, may lead them to scapegoat particular groups whose different behavior practices can be blamed for contributing to what is wrong with their world and why they're not getting ahead. Now, for other Bajans like Assassin, moral decay appears to be linked to the feminization of the economy and public life, domains which are perceived to be traditionally heterosexual and masculine. For these Bajans, an economy which is perceived to be increasingly more feminine and subservient as it shifts towards increased reliance on tourism or service industry-based labor, results in fewer and fewer appropriate masculine employment opportunities. The shift to a service economy not only creates a perception of a more feminized economy, but also feminizes national identity from a heteropatriarchal position. So a nation state which accepts homosexuality is, from this perspective, proof of a powerless, penetrated, emasculated loser on the world stage. So in other words, I'm arguing that these opinions found in Barbadian media are produced through a heteropatriarchal logic that originates in a first wave form of globalization known as colonialism, which has been reproduced but also challenged through the turbulent and uneven effects of economic, political, and cultural globalization over the last 20 years. These popular opinions, combined with the absence of local gay or lesbian voices in Bajan media, result in what I call a spectral sexuality that haunts the Barbadian mediascapes, where a threatening, perverted, or sick homosexualized body is continually incarnated in media discourse, but never fully instantiated in the flesh. These deviant, ghostly bodies that haunt the dominant discourse of a national body, imagined to be heterosexual and masculine, which is perceived to be under attack from outside and inside forces. So this is a haunting that's produced by global political, economic, and social changes, which are contributing towards a greater socioeconomic chasm between a small elite business class, a stressed and fragile middle class, and a growing class of working poor or unemployed in Barbados and indeed throughout much of the Caribbean. These perceptions and experiences of marginalization and destabilization increase local surveillance of the sources of such instability. Homosexuals and their so-called agenda are this source for some Bajans. They are the bogeymen of a turbulent and stressful modernity in the new millennium, representing all that is wrong with contemporary social life in a developing nation located on the margins of Euro-American nation states' economic and political agendas. Now, when we turn to the French-speaking Caribbean, with Martinique as my primary example, we see homophobia or sexual discrimination unfolding in a socio-political climate that is similar to but distinct from the situation in Barbados. The primary similarity lies in the ways in which both countries are often described by media in the global north as having homophobic cultures, generated by similar historical and cultural factors. However, one of the key distinctions lies in Martinique's status as an overseas department of France, subject to the French legal system, where there have been no laws against homosexuality since anti-sodomy laws were repealed in 1791. Now today, France has national legislation prohibiting sexual orientation and gender identity-based discrimination in employment, housing, and other public services, and since 2013 has recognized same-sex marriages as legal. So while there is no need to change or repeal homophobic laws in Martinique and other French overseas departments, local activists argue that there continues to be widespread hostility toward sexual minorities. However, as Vanessa Agar-Jones observes, that in some really great work looking at sexual discrimination in Martinique, much of this discussion about homophobia in Martinique is often initiated in the metropole or mainland France by academics and LGBT media there, who often argue that things like a conservative Christian culture or the circulation of homophobic lyrics from Jamaican dancehall music promote intolerance of sexual minorities. And she argues that these explanations work to uphold a binary opposition of Caribbeanness that gets associated with homophobia, black popular culture, and religiosity, to Frenchness that's associated with rights, safety, and secularism. And these representations end up reinscribing the notion that the Antilles, the French Antilles, are places in need of development to catch up to the French metropole's modern democratic and secular civil society. As she notes, as Agar Jones notes, in the mostly metropolitan crafting of a particularly Antillean villain and homophobic victim, the possibilities for resistance get limited to calls for development, usually through education about rights, which end up ignoring and silencing queer Antillians and their experiences. So this call to rights illustrates this other key component of the analytical framework of sexual discrimination. When we shift our focus from questions about the production of sexual discrimination in the Caribbean to questions of how to combat it, we often see responses that emphasize three actions. First, to challenge and repeal laws which criminalize homosexual acts or behaviors. Second, to legally protect the rights of sexual minorities such that any form of discrimination against them becomes unlawful. And third, to change social or popular attitudes towards homosexuality. Often the three actions are interconnected. Movements to change criminal laws are legitimized in part through talk about the need to recognize the rights of LGBTQ people. Once these rights are enshrined, it's argued that it will be easier to change problematic popular attitudes. But once again, this sort of generalist strategy emphasizing rights to combat discrimination becomes somewhat problematic when we start to look at Caribbean societies on a case-by-case basis. For example, in Barbados, changing the anti-sodomy laws continues to be a priority for some organizations, as anti-discrimination legislation cannot be enacted until the laws criminalizing same-sex activities are repealed. On the other hand, in Martinique, no laws need to be changed, but public attitudes towards homosexuality remain problematic. In both countries, despite these different scenarios, the rights of LGBTQ people continue to be circulated as one of the primary mechanisms through which more just and inclusive societies may be created. Now in Barbados, as I said, human rights are this key sort of framework through which arguments for repealing the anti-sodomy laws are formulated. But when I was doing fieldwork there in the mid-2000s, I found that rights were often being defined and interpreted in different ways. And so here are three different ways that I heard them being talked about or defined. One of the first and most visible invocations of human rights was made by then Attorney General Mia Mottley, who supported the repeal of the anti-sodomy laws. And Attorney General Mottley said, this is her quote, "While we would like to believe that there are normative values that will guide the society, the reality is that a government in a pluralistic society must accommodate and respect the human rights and the dignity of each individual. To that extent, any law which seeks to discriminate in a society whose history has been scarred with the cancer of discrimination has to be reformed." Now, at the public forums that were organized to get feedback on the possibility of changing the criminal code, some people's comments presented rights in a second and different light from how Motley framed them. So one audience member at these forums said that she could not understand why the government should support the idea of giving rights to a group who engaged in activities that most Bajans do not approve of. Another person spoke passionately about the need to protect Barbados against the gay agenda, which he said was being promoted by a highly organized secret group of members in positions of political and economic power around the world who were trying to force all nations to accept their gay rights manifesto. And a third, I'll unpack these a bit more in a minute, but here's the third interpretation of rights that emerged. This emerged at a Barbadian LGBT support group who had monthly meetings, and at this meeting people were discussing their experiences of discrimination, and one of them, named Pat, stood up to say how she had often been, she identified as transgender, and she stood up to say how she'd often been mistreated in stores around Bridgetown, where she'd often be ignored by staff, or she'd be told that they couldn't help her with what she was looking for. And after saying that, she then pulled out 2 sheets of paper saying that she now carried around with her the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which she had downloaded from the web. So she could now show people that piece of paper, and that would help show that she is equal and deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. She said, quote, "What we need in Barbados is for people to recognize us as humans, not just gays. That declaration is about human rights, and I think we should be promoting human rights here, not gay rights," unquote. So in these examples, I think there is more than one way of understanding what rights mean. One way of understanding rights is as a demand for the political and legal equality of each individual citizen of the nation state. So Attorney General Motley's reference to changing laws that are discriminatory against a group of individuals fits this interpretation. As Samuel Chambers observes, this statement reflects a basic liberal understanding of rights as guarantors of individual freedom based on the natural equality of all human beings. The second example from the public forum presented a different interpretation of what we might think of as special rights, that is, rights as a demand made by a particular minority group to be given protected status or to be treated in a special way that will prove prejudicial to the majority. So that interpretation can be found in the statement by the individual who said she did not understand why a group should be given rights when their sexual orientation is not approved of by most Barbadians. Similarly, another individual who spoke of how an elite group was trying to impose its gay agenda on Barbados, granting it a privileged position above the majority of Barbadians, is working with rights in the same way. And now a third way of reading rights is what Chamber calls hegemonic articulation. By this he means a particular demand, such as just changing discriminatory criminal laws, emerges out of the needs of a particular group, but then does so as part of a political battle that's dedicated to a more universal project or goals that are benefiting society as a whole. So I think Pat's comments at the LGBT support group follow this line of reasoning when she was emphasizing that the UN Declaration of Human Rights entitled her to be respected as equal to and no different from other Bajans. So I think what these comments demonstrate is that within the language of human rights discourses are tensions or contradictions which allow for different interpretations of rights. And Talal Assad has written about rights in sort of different contexts, and he observes that universal human rights discourses are inherently hamstrung through their construction out of and against the nation state. While they espouse the equal and inalienable rights of the human family, responsibility and authority for their implementation is under the jurisdiction of the sovereign nation state. However, the nation state is often also deeply invested in creating an exclusive national identity, such that narratives of national values and good citizenship are aligned with geopolitical borders, which create outsiders both inside and outside those borders who do not deserve the same rights due to their improper moral character, amongst other qualities. So Bajan homosexuals are these outsiders that are outside the proper national character values, as some of these audience members noted at the public forum, and therefore they do not deserve to have rights equal to other Bajans. So compounding the interpretive problem of like what rights mean is the fact that over the past 10 to 15 years, human rights for LGBT groups have been utilized increasingly as a weapon against and a badge of distinction between developed and developing countries. Matthew Ngelke has analyzed how the government of Zimbabwe under President Robert Mugabe vigorously rejected international human rights groups supporting the rights of sexual minorities in his country, claiming that the language of human rights is imperialistic, disrespectful of national culture, and largely irrelevant to what it means to be human. As Ngelke points out, it is problematic to speak about Zimbabwean culture as a singular, undifferentiated entity, but it is also problematic to speak about gay rights in a place with a colonial history where Euro-American concepts of gay identity do not apply or carry different meanings pertaining to racialized desire, identity, and sociality. Now in Martinique, there is also talk about the importance of the rights of LGBTQ people. However, it's located in a distinctly French context, which imposes different kinds of limits. French nationalists have a particularly romantic, self-congratulatory narrative about their relationship to rights, in which they often state that France is where human rights were born, were first articulated in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, a founding document of the modern French state from 1789. That kind of declaration puts Martinican queer activists between a rock and a hard place. How does one argue for rights when they're located in the nation state that claims to be the founder of human rights and the founder of a form of universalism based on a common humanity that guarantees rights to all of mankind? Furthermore, as I noted earlier, much of this debate about homophobia and rights for LGBT people in Martinique is being articulated through diasporic and metropolitan voices, leaving little or no space for local queer voices, strategies, and experiences. So these discussions of rights in Martinique and Barbados hopefully demonstrate how local, national, and international LGBT and human rights organizations are embedded in complex, colonially inflected socio-political realities. The evidence from this paper's examples hopefully indicates that framing anti-discrimination discourses only through the lens of human rights can produce unpredictable results that may actually have deleterious effects, as some interpretations of rights may actually be used to underscore anti-colonial nationalist rhetoric and actually further marginalize already stigmatized groups. Now, Sally Engel-Mary, who's an anthropologist who's focused on, written quite a bit on human rights discourses and has done some really interesting analysis of the ways in which transnational discourses of human rights are adapted or transformed in local settings. And I think she provides an interesting alternative approach to thinking about human rights in different socio-political contexts. Mary focuses mostly on human rights approaches to combating gender violence, violence against women. And she outlines how human rights are often made in the vernacular, or remade in the vernacular. In other words, she demonstrates the ways in which new ideas of rights are framed and presented in terms of existing cultural norms, values, and practices. As she notes, this is a difficult and complex process, requiring translators who are critically important in localizing human rights discourses. Furthermore, this process is not always successful. If human rights are presented as compatible with existing ways of thinking, they will not induce any kind of change. But I think this idea of a similar sort of vernacularization of rights discourses is worth considering as a strategy for the Caribbean. And indeed, there are already numerous LGBTQ groups in some of the English-speaking Caribbean nations, such as CAISO in Trinidad and CESAD, those are acronyms, CESAD in Guyana. There's also this group, Caraïbe in Martinique. And these are groups who are already developing kind of alternative strategies in which principles embodied in human rights discourses are fused with local vernacular linguistic practices and performances, which convey values emphasizing justice, equality, dignity, and respect for all citizens. So in other words, I'm arguing for hegemonic articulation strategies of equality that are articulated within and through Caribbean social traditions, linguistic practices, and values. These strategies parallel concepts that are contained in international human rights discourses, but are constructed through different procedures and practices. In other words, not only legalistic frameworks. This is always and absolutely a politicized process that will always involve struggles over meanings, as it is clear that there are local practices and values that promote inequality or ranking of people based on perceptions of sexual preference or gender identity. It's also a strategy that requires deployment in numerous online and offline sites in English and French-speaking Caribbean societies, with particular attention to the realms of everyday, informal, and popular culture, informal, semi-private social spaces, and religious worlds, which could be a whole paper unto itself. It's a strategy that prioritizes local grassroots organization without dismissing the goals of those who are advocating for legal and constitutional change. So vernacularization as a strategy and a tactic also reminds us that so-called support from international or metropolitan LGBT organizations and governments via economic sanctions may backfire through stirring up what Anne Stiller calls imperial debris, the ongoing memories and material inequalities generated through a colonial past. While changes for sexual and gender minorities are clearly unfolding across French and Caribbean societies in the present moment, we cannot turn this conversation or let it become a simple rescue the victim narrative. Rather, we must continue to research the ways in which multiple social, economic, and political factors at local and global scales produce friction, which embodies the goals of, challenges to, and opportunities for differentially positioned Caribbean sexual and gender minorities. Thank you.